On the 30th of July, 1943, during the heavy fighting on the Eastern Front, a German anti-tank detachment guarding a narrow forest road faced an impossible situation. A Soviet armored column, three light tanks, two T-34s, and a line of support vehicles, was pushing straight toward their position. The Germans had only one functional 7.5 centimeter anti-tank gun, limited ammunition, and no room to retreat. The road curved sharply to the left, cutting their visibility to just a few dozen meters. Any tank that rounded that bend would be within firing range of the German gun, and just as capable of destroying it under standard doctrine. The crew should have withdrawn immediately. Staying meant suicide. But the gunner refused. He studied the terrain in front of them, the steep ditch on one side, the forest slope on the other, the narrow bend, the soft ground, the way the curve forced every vehicle to slow down for a moment. Then he made a decision his crew thought was insane. He ordered them to rotate the gun 15 degrees off the road and aim not at the center of the bend, but at a muddy patch of ground beside it. An odd angle, one that broke every rule of anti-tank engagement. The loader protested. The gun commander hesitated, but the gunner insisted. He had noticed something the others had missed. The curve forced every tank to shift its weight. The mud beside the bend caused tracks to slip for less than a second. That second created a predictable moment. A moment when armor tilted, traction broke, and the side plate, normally angled, flattened almost perfectly. He wasn't aiming at tanks. He was aiming at physics. The crew grudgingly set the new angle. The gunner lowered the barrel a few millimeters, aligning it precisely with the spot where a tank's hull would momentarily level. Then he ordered the loader to prepare armor-piercing rounds and keep his hands clear. He expected to fire fast, faster than doctrine allowed. A distant rumble shook the forest. The column was coming. Branches trembled. The road vibrated. A scout vehicle appeared first, bouncing around the curve, engine whining as it corrected its steering. The gunner didn't fire. He waited. Then the first T-34 lurched into view. It hit the mud patch. The tank's weight shifted. The hull leaned, and for a split second, less than the blink of an eye, its side armor stood straight. The gunner fired. The shell punched through the T-34's hull, slicing directly into the engine compartment. Flames erupted instantly, blocking the road in one explosion of black smoke and burning fuel. The Soviet column ground to a halt. The road narrowed. The curve prevented maneuvering, and the Germans finally understood. The gunner's crazy tactic wasn't madness. It was a trap. The burning T-34 jammed the road completely, its turret jammed sideways, tracks locking as smoke billowed upward. The Soviet drivers behind it slammed brakes, but on the narrow forest road there was nowhere to turn, nowhere to reverse with precision, and no way to see what had caused the explosion beyond the bend. The German gunner had predicted that too. He yelled for the loader, another armor-piercing round. Before the smoke from the first shot even settled, the next Soviet vehicle, a light tank, crawled around the curve. Its driver cut speed sharply, trying to avoid crashing into the burning T-34. And the gunner's trick triggered again. The sudden deceleration caused the tank's front end to dip, shifting weight to the right. For a heartbeat, its side plate aligned perfectly with the gun's offset angle. The gunner fired the instant the hull leveled. The shell smashed directly into the side armor. The light tank jerked, engine sputtering, then collapsed sideways into the ditch, blocking the right edge of the road. 2 Soviet armor losses in under 20 seconds. The column commander tried to react, shouting for the following vehicles to pull back. But panic spread faster than orders. Support trucks struck one another as they attempted to reverse on the cramped path. A second T-34 tried to force its way forward, ramming a supply truck aside, scraping its hull against trees. Splinters flew, branches cracked. The German gunner watched through the haze. He wasn't firing blind. He was firing at moments, not machines. The second T-34 ground forward, angling to push the burning wreck and clear the road's smoke obscured everything. Perfect for the gunner. He waited unmoving, tracking the shadow of the tank rather than its shape. The moment it hit the muddy patch, the hull leaned outward, stabilizing for the briefest instant. Fire. The shell punched through its turret ring. The T-34 erupted in a violent blast that tore its turret partially free. The force pushed the burning tank harder into the first wreck, sealing the road behind a wall of steel and fire. The Soviet column was now trapped inside a funnel, a kill zone created not by artillery, not by mines, not by air power, but by a single gunner with a precise understanding of timing. The Germans couldn't believe it. The loader's hands shook as he rammed the next round. The gun commander whispered, "This is impossible." But the gunner wasn't done. Through the smoke, he saw what came next. A Soviet half-track attempting to skirt along the left side, wheels sliding in the mud, desperately trying to bypass the carnage. The gunner did the unthinkable. He ordered high explosive, not armor-piercing. The loader hesitated. "Are you sure?" The gunner didn't repeat himself. When the half-track's wheels hit the mud slope, the vehicle lurched sideways. The gunner fired. The explosion ripped out under the chassis, flipping the half-track onto its side and blocking the last usable gap on the left edge of the road. In less than 1 minute, the Soviet column had lost 3 armored vehicles, a half-track, and all mobility. The Germans heard shouting from the Soviet side, orders mixing with confusion, engines revving, metal grinding as vehicles attempted to reverse blindly. Their formation was collapsing into chaos, and the gunner, calm and steady, whispered, "They're stuck, now we finish it." The Soviet column was now trapped in a situation no commander trains for. A narrow road, burning armor choking the front, a ditch and forest hemming in both flanks, and an unseen anti-tank gun firing with impossible precision from somewhere beyond the bend. Engines roared as drivers tried to back up, but the road was too tight. A supply truck struck a fuel carrier. A half-track clipped a tree and spun its wheels uselessly. One wrong turn became a chain reaction of blocked vehicles, and the German gunner exploited every second of it. He ordered the crew to keep the barrel fixed at the same strange offset angle. The gun commander questioned it. "We can't see the next target." But the gunner knew targets didn't matter now. Movements mattered. Weight shifts, tilts. Predictable mechanical reactions of overloaded vehicles trying to reverse on mud. The next victim wasn't even armored. A Soviet fuel truck, forced backward by shouted orders from the rear of the column, slid sideways as its tires hit churned earth. The heavy tank behind it reversed too quickly and bumped its rear bumper, jolting the truck's chassis. The jolt flattened the side panel for half a heartbeat. The gunner fired instantly. The shell sliced into the fuel tank. A pressure wave ripped outward, sending a column of flames straight into the sky. The entire forest road lit up. Heat washed over the German crew. Soviet soldiers screamed orders in every direction. The loader had barely inserted the next round when the gunner shouted, "Prepare, he!" He was already tracking the shadows again. Through the black smoke and orange flames, another truck jerked backward, hitting a tree and bouncing forward. Another predictable tilt. Another perfect moment. The gunner fired. The truck's engine compartment exploded into pieces, scattering debris across the road and trapping another vehicle behind it. The Soviet column was no longer a column. It was a mechanical pileup of steel, fire, and wreckage. The Soviet infantry escort, now fully exposed, jumped off their transport trucks and ran for cover on both sides of the road. But there was no cover. The terrain dropped steeply on one side and rose in a slick slope on the other. Men slid, stumbled, or froze as the anti-tank gun's thunder echoed through the trees. The gunner didn't waste shells on fleeing soldiers. He focused only on vehicles, because vehicles were the real targets. Vehicles trapped troops. Vehicles blocked the rear. Vehicles created the panic. A Soviet armored car tried to reverse out of the kill zone, swerving violently to avoid running over infantry scattered across the road. Its rear wheels slipped off the mud edge, lifting the front. The gunner fired again. The armored car buckled, rolled onto its side, and sealed off a 20-meter stretch of road with twisted metal. The German commander stared at the destruction in disbelief. "All of this," he murmured, "from one angle." It wasn't an exaggeration. The gunner's tactic, fire at the moment the armor flattened, was working again and again, and the Soviets had no idea what was happening. They couldn't see the gun. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't fire back through the smoke. All they knew was that every vehicle that moved became a target, and every attempt to escape made the situation worse. The gunner checked the breach, wiped smoke from his eyes, and pointed down the road. "One more," he said. "We break the rear. Then they're finished." The crew braced themselves. They were about to collapse the entire column from both ends in under 2 minutes. The Soviet rear vehicles still didn't understand what had happened at the front. They heard explosions, saw smoke rising beyond the bend, and felt the road tremble with each detonation. But they assumed it was mines or artillery, not a single anti-tank gun positioned with impossible accuracy. So when the commander at the back shouted for all vehicles to push forward and clear the blockage, they obeyed. A heavy supply truck accelerated toward the bend, engine roaring. Infantry jogged alongside it, rifles ready, expecting to reinforce comrades at the front. They couldn't see the wreckage yet. They couldn't see the burning T-34. They couldn't see the half-track flipped on its side. All they saw was smoke thickening between the trees. The German gunner waited. He wasn't guessing anymore. He knew exactly what the next vehicle would do. The rear truck would hit the same muddy shift at the bend. Its weight would tilt. Its side would flatten. He kept the gun fixed on the same impossible angle. The truck reached the mud patch, suspension groaning under the load tilt. Fire. The shell pierced the truck's side tank, blowing it apart in a blast of shrapnel and fire. The vehicle skidded sideways, blocked the rear of the road, and crushed two infantrymen who had run too close to it. Now the Soviet column was trapped from both directions, with burning steel sealing the front and a destroyed truck sealing the rear. Exactly as the gunner intended, Soviet infantry at the back froze. Some scrambled uphill into the forest, slipping on wet leaves and sliding back down. Others crouched behind wheels or crates, but there was no real cover anywhere. The forest slope was too steep. The ditch was too deep. The road was too narrow. The gunner shifted his attention again, not to the truck, but to what would follow it. A Soviet light tank pushed forward from the rear, trying to ram its way to the front to break the blockade. The commander inside assumed only small vehicles were hit so far. He thought he could muscle through. He reached the bend. Mud patch. Suspension dip. Track slip. Predictable tilt. The gunner fired before the turret even appeared fully through the smoke. The round hit the tank square in the side plate. The explosion ripped through the hull, and the tank came to a dead stop, turret rocking violently as smoke poured from the hatch. The Soviet rearguard collapsed into chaos. Soldiers ran in every direction, some toward the forest, some back down the road, some toward burning wrecks in a desperate attempt to pull comrades free. The German gun crew moved like a machine now. The loader rammed shells into the breach with practiced rhythm. The commander kept scanning the tree line for threats. The assistant gunner steadied the carriage with his shoulder. But all of them knew the truth. It was the gunner alone who understood this trap. Another Soviet vehicle tried reversing. The gunner waited for the exact moment its wheels lifted slightly off-center from the uneven road. Another tiny mechanical tell. Another perfect moment, fire. The shell smashed through its chassis. The vehicle collapsed in the middle of the rear section, sealing the last possible escape route. The Soviet officers at the back finally understood the truth. This wasn't artillery. This wasn't mines. This wasn't multiple guns. This was one man firing at the same point, using the terrain to undo an entire armored group. The Soviet column, once a powerful spear point of steel, had turned into a crush of wrecked vehicles, blocked roads, and panicked troops. And the gunner, breathing slowly, eyes fixed on the smoke ahead, said quietly, "They're finished. They just don't know it yet." With both ends of the column sealed by burning wrecks, the Soviet formation turned into a steel corridor with no exit. Engines roared uselessly. Smoke filled the narrow road, mixing with dust kicked up by panicked infantry. Commands echoed down the line, but each order contradicted the next. Advance, reverse, dismount, hold position. No one could see. No one knew who was in charge anymore. The German gunner exploited the confusion with mechanical precision. He didn't search for targets. He didn't adjust for each shot. He kept the gun locked onto the same offset angle, knowing that every vehicle entering the bend, front or rear, would repeat the same mistake. Weight shift, track slip, armor tilt. It was the most predictable battlefield imaginable. Predictable because the road forced it. Another Soviet armored car pushed forward from the center of the column, trying to bulldoze its way through a supply truck blocking the middle. The driver revved the engine, wheels spinning, pushing the truck a few meters, just enough to expose his own side to that cursed bend. The gunner fired. The armored car shuddered, then collapsed sideways against a tree, blocking the center of the column as well. Now the Soviet line was split into three trapped clusters: front, middle, and rear, each unable to support the others. The middle group tried to escape on foot. Infantry leaped from vehicles and sprinted for the forest slope, boots slipping on wet leaves. Some tried climbing uphill but slid back down. Others dropped into the ditch, which was deeper than it looked, and sucked at their legs with thick mud. The gunner ignored them. His eyes stayed on the smoke-choked bend. A Soviet commander near the middle shouted for infantry to form a firing line. They tried, but visibility was awful. Black smoke rolled through the trees. Burning fuel from the first T-34 coated the air with thick fumes. The soldiers fired blindly into the forest, bullets striking branches and ricocheting into the road. The gunner didn't return fire. Shooting infantry would reveal his exact position. He waited for the next vehicle to move. He knew one would, and it did. A Soviet support truck, engine panicking under a confused driver, jerked forward trying to escape the center blockade. It bumped a dead tank, angled sideways, and slid its rear wheels into the mud patch tilt. Flatten. Fire. The truck detonated like a drum, scattering shattered planks across the road. At this point, the Soviets were certain multiple German guns were firing at them from different angles. Some shouted that there were 3 guns. Others insisted there were 5. None could understand why every round struck at perfect moments. The German commander behind the gun whispered, "They think we're a whole battery." The gunner didn't smile. He simply reloaded. For the Soviets trapped at the front, the psychological effect was devastating. They huddled behind burning wrecks, listening to each new explosion behind them, realizing the column was collapsing inward. They radioed for support, but interference in terrain blocked most transmissions. A Soviet tank commander near the front finally snapped. He climbed out of his turret and shouted to his crew, "We break out on foot. Leave the armor." But as soon as the tank crew dropped to the ground, they faced the same reality as the infantry. Steep forest slope on one side, deep ditch on the other, and a blocked burning road ahead. There was nowhere to go. The German gunner watched shapes flicker in the smoke. He could hear the Soviets abandoning vehicles, but he wasn't finished yet. He knew the column still had one last armored vehicle near the middle, a lightly armored tractor pulling ammunition crates. If it moved even slightly, it would expose its thin side. And after a full minute of chaos, it did. The driver tried to reposition, wheels slipping. The tractor angled, exposing its side through a momentary gap in the smoke. The gunner fired. The explosion ignited the ammunition crates. A chain reaction of detonations tore through the center cluster. Soviet infantry dove for cover. Flames shot upward in violent bursts, each blast shaking the road and collapsing what little structure remained of the formation. When the smoke cleared, the German gun crew saw what the gunner had already predicted. The Soviet column was effectively dead, immobilized, isolated, burning in 3 separate sections, and the gunner still had ammunition. The chain of explosions from the ammunition tractor rolled through the forest like thunder. Leaves shook loose from branches. Birds burst into the sky. Soviet infantry near the center cluster threw themselves flat, expecting more blasts. Those at the front and rear froze, listening to the rolling detonations and realizing something none of them had understood until now. They weren't being shelled. They weren't being bombed. They weren't caught in a minefield. Every explosion came from one direction, one angle, one impossible firing position. That terrifying clarity hit all 3 Soviet groups at once. The officer trapped near the front shouted for his men to deploy smoke grenades. A cloud rose quickly, but the wind pulled it sideways, thinning it before it reached the bend. Another shouted for machine guns to suppress the tree line. But suppress what? They still hadn't seen the gun. Meanwhile, the German gunner watched the smoke drift harmlessly away. He knew the Soviets were finally trying to react intelligently. He also knew it wouldn't matter, Because the trap wasn't created by concealment, it was created by terrain. The Soviets could fire all they wanted into the forest. Their rounds struck trunks, branches, and soil. Nothing, absolutely nothing, threatened the German gun. The gunner remained calm, calculating, eyes fixed on the single muddy patch that had defeated more armor than a minefield. But the Soviets still had one more vehicle capable of movement, a small armored tractor in the rear cluster, barely damaged, with a functioning engine. Its crew, desperate and terrified, started it up. The vehicle jerked forward, wheels spinning, trying to reach the center before more explosions consumed them. The gunner tracked the tractor through the smoke without seeing it directly, only glimpsing the shift of shadows and the way the smoke moved around moving metal. He didn't fire yet. He waited for the exact moment the tractor crossed the bend. He knew where it would appear. He knew how it would tilt. He knew the shot before he even saw the vehicle. The tractor hit the mud. Tilt, flatten, fire. The shell struck squarely, flipping the light vehicle sideways and blocking what little space remained in the rear gap. The Soviet infantry near the back recoiled as the wreck rolled toward them. Some lost their footing and fell into the ditch. Others bolted uphill again, only to slide back down into mud. A few fired wildly toward the imagined German battery, convinced they were surrounded. These weren't tactical decisions now. This was survival panic. The gunner exhaled slowly, almost relieved. This last hit meant the Soviet column, front, center, rear, was sealed by steel and fire so tightly that even on foot, escape routes were uncertain. The forest slope was too steep, the ditch was too deep, and the road was a line of burning wrecks. But one group of Soviets hadn't given up. A small squad from the middle cluster formed a line and tried to push manually through the wreckage. They shoved against a scorched truck frame, tried to lever open space with rifles, even attempted to climb over a half-melted tank track. They weren't trying to fight, they were trying to get away. The gunner didn't fire, not because he was hesitant, but because he knew firing at infantry would reveal their precise location. Instead, he turned to the corporal and said, "Hold, let them struggle." And struggle they did. Every second they wasted climbing over wrecks made the trap tighter. Every shout for help echoed down the road. Every attempt to reorganize failed the moment someone slipped on burning fuel. Then came the moment that shattered them completely. A Soviet soldier shouted, "It's one gun! Just one gun!" His voice traveled down the entire line. The entire Soviet column finally understood all their armor, all their vehicles, all their firepower, destroyed or trapped by a single German anti-tank gun firing from a single angle. The psychological impact crushed what little cohesion remained. The rear cluster began retreating on foot. The center cluster scattered into the forest. The front cluster huddled behind burning armor, hoping the nightmare would stop. The German gunner lowered the barrel and said quietly, "Now they break." And they did. The Soviet column had collapsed, groups splitting in every direction, some fleeing into the forest, others pinned behind burning wrecks, a few still trying to free vehicles that would never move again. The German gunner finally allowed the barrel to cool. For the first time since the ambush began, the forest fell into a momentary, eerie stillness. But the chaos he'd created didn't end with his last shot. It continued growing on its own. A Soviet soldier from the middle cluster attempted to climb over a burning T-34, slipping on the scorched metal and falling into the ditch. Another tried to pull him out, only to slide down after him. A third jumped in to help, and within seconds the ditch was filled with confused, panicking soldiers who couldn't climb the mud-slicked walls. Behind them, a support truck's ruptured fuel tank leaked fire across the road, creating a creeping sheet of flame that cut the center cluster into two groups. Men scrambled to escape as burning fuel ran underneath stalled vehicles and ignited ammunition boxes. The trap was now feeding itself. The rear cluster suffered just as badly. The overturned tractor blocked the only exit, and smoke rolling uphill blinded the soldiers. Some fled sideways, trying to scale the forest's steep slope. They grabbed at roots, branches, and tufts of grass, but the slope was wet, slick, and too steep to climb under stress. Dozens slid back down. Every failed escape attempt convinced another man to panic. The gunner watched all this with cold calculation. He had predicted the mechanical reactions of vehicles, but now he was watching the psychological ones unfold. The more the Soviets struggled, the worse their situation became. The German commander asked, "Should we advance?" The gunner shook his head. "No need. They're destroying themselves." And they were. At the front of the column, the Soviet officer hiding behind the burning T-34 made one last attempt to rally his men. He ordered them to form a defensive perimeter and fire blindly into the forest. But as soldiers tried to reposition, they discovered something terrifying. Every movement exposed them. Every position was compromised. Every angle of fire was blocked. Some turned their rifles toward the trees, others toward the road, but none had a clear target. Every shot sounded like it came from a different direction. The smoldering wrecks distorted sound, the forest amplified echoes, and the narrow road funneled noise unpredictably. They thought they were surrounded. They weren't, but their minds filled the gaps with fear. Meanwhile, the gunner repositioned slightly, not the gun, but himself. He moved behind a fallen tree, observing how the Soviet clusters were shrinking, how movement patterns changed, and how the smoke began drifting sideways as wind shifted. He didn't plan a new tactic. He didn't need one. The battlefield now operated according to his rules. A Soviet group near the center tried a coordinated breakout. 7 men ran for the trench on the left side. They slid down, muddied, and tried crawling along it to escape. But burning debris rolled into the ditch behind them, trapping them between rising flames and a collapsed vehicle. The gunner didn't fire. The battlefield did the work for him. At the rear, another group attempted to reverse one of the surviving trucks manually. Dozens of soldiers pushed against the rear bumper. The wheel spun in place, sinking deeper into mud. A man slipped, fell under the wheel, and the truck dropped onto him as the mud gave way. His screams shattered any sense of order left. The Soviet line no longer existed. It was a scattering of terrified men in a burning bottleneck. Only now did the gunner speak to his crew again. "We move soon," he said, "but not yet." His commander understood. Advancing too early risked walking into pockets of Soviet troops still armed and desperate. Better to let confusion drain them further. Let panic suffocate the will to fight. Then a new sound broke through the forest. At first faint, then clear. German reinforcements. Boots marching. Voices calling. Metal clinking. The gunner's trap had bought them the time they needed. The Soviet troops heard it too, and that was the final trigger. The last remnants of discipline evaporated. Those who hadn't run now ran. Those who hadn't panicked now panicked. 2 minutes of firing had created a catastrophe. But the aftermath, the collapse, the psychological spiral, the self-destruction, was still unfolding. And for the gunner, this was exactly the battlefield he had engineered. The sound of German reinforcements advancing through the forest was the final blow to the Soviet column's will to fight. Branches snapped, orders were shouted. Metal clattered as rifles and gear struck against webbing. Even though the reinforcements had not yet reached the road, their presence was unmistakable. Steady, organized, confident. To the Soviets, pinned in a narrow corridor of burning vehicles, it sounded like an entire battalion. The trapped soldiers reacted instantly. Those near the rear scattered into the trees, slipping down the slope or tripping over roots. A few tried to hold position and fire back toward the sound, but their shots were wild. Bullets striking branches above their heads, the forest swallowed their fire. Nothing they did slowed the approaching footsteps. In the center of the column, where flames from the destroyed ammunition tractor still flickered along the ground, a group of Soviet infantry attempted to break out up the slope for a third time. They pushed each other upward, boots sliding on wet leaves, hands grabbing at thin branches. One man reached a fallen log halfway up, then slipped, dragging 3 others down with him. They tumbled to the ditch floor, their rifles scattering. Every failed escape attempt fed the panic further. At the front, the Soviet officer behind the burning T-34 realized the truth. His armored support could not move. His infantry was broken, and the enemy gun had inflicted more damage in 2 minutes than a minefield or ambush team would usually cause in 10. He ordered his remaining men to abandon the vehicles and retreat on foot. Back through the forest, away from the road. But the forest offered no safety, smoke drifted between the trees. The terrain sloped unpredictably, and the easiest paths were already filled with fleeing soldiers from other clusters. The officer pushed forward anyway, until he heard German voices echoing from the left flank, closer than expected. Reinforcements were almost on top of them. The German gunner, however, didn't join his advancing comrades yet. He remained beside his anti-tank gun, eyes still scanning the smoke-filled road. He saw movement, a Soviet machine gun team trying desperately to set up behind a disabled armored car. The assistant gunner struggled to feed the belt. The operator cursed as he searched for a target in the haze. But the gunner didn't fire. The Soviets were aiming at trees. The German reinforcements weren't even in sight yet. The gunner simply whispered, "Let them waste their strength." And the Soviets did. When the German infantry finally appeared through a break in the trees, helmet silhouettes emerging from the forest shade, the Soviets broke completely. Some threw down rifles. Others ran deeper into the woods, stumbling blindly. A few dropped to the ground, hands over their heads, hoping the flames and smoke would hide them. The German infantry fanned out with practiced discipline, rifles raised, advancing cautiously through the wreckage. They expected a fierce firefight. Instead, they found overturned vehicles, burning trucks, and isolated Soviet soldiers fleeing in every direction. One German sergeant stared at the destruction, unable to comprehend how a single gun crew had done this. "Where's the battery positioned?" he demanded. "There is no battery," the commander of the AT gun answered. "Just us." The sergeant looked at the wrecks. 7 destroyed or crippled vehicles, multiple fires, the road sealed at both ends, and then at the gunner, who wiped smoke from his eyes with the back of his hand. "You did this?" the sergeant asked. The gunner didn't answer. He didn't need to. The battlefield spoke for him. Smoke drifted over burned armor. Ammunition popped softly inside destroyed trucks. Soviet rifles and gear lay abandoned everywhere, and the wreckage formed a twisted metal barrier nearly 100 meters long. The reinforcements advanced between the burning hulks, securing prisoners, clearing pockets of resistance, and checking for survivors. The gunner watched them go, finally stepping back from the gun he had held like a scalpel. The 2-minute trap was complete. The column was annihilated, and the forest road belonged to the Germans again. But the story wasn't finished. Reinforcements had questions, and higher command would demand answers, because no one had ever heard of a tactic like this, and no one understood how one gunner had turned a narrow forest bend into a perfect mechanical ambush. When the firing finally stopped and the last pockets of Soviet resistance faded into the trees, German officers moved carefully through the wreckage, taking in a scene that looked more like the aftermath of an airstrike than the work of a single anti-tank gun. Vehicles lay crushed together in a half-kilometer stretch. Burned-out tanks, overturned trucks, a flipped tractor, shattered crates, and tangled metal fused by fire. Every few meters, a crater or scorch mark told the same story. Each shot had landed at a perfect angle, as if the gunner had calculated every impact with mathematical precision. But he hadn't moved the gun at all. That was the part no one understood. An officer from the reinforcement unit approached the gun crew with a notebook in hand. "Who ordered this angle?" he asked, pointing to the strange diagonal alignment of the AT gun. The crew exchanged looks. "The gunner," the loader finally answered. The officer frowned. "Why? The road is right there. Why not aim straight?" The commander simply replied, "Because he wasn't aiming at the road." The officer followed the barrel's line of fire and saw it pointed not at the bend itself, but slightly off to a patch of mud. A spot so ordinary it wouldn't draw attention from anyone who didn't understand what the gunner had seen. The way vehicles rolled into it, tilted, straightened for a fraction of a second the gunner had weaponized. As reinforcements cleared the far end of the column, they confirmed what the gunner had already implied. No mines, no explosives, no hidden anti-tank teams. Just one gun firing at the exact micro moments when Soviet armor exposed its weakest profile. Soldiers who had arrived late couldn't believe it. One pointed at a collapsed truck and asked, "How does a 7.5-centimeter gun flip a vehicle sideways like that?" "Timing," the gunner said quietly. He offered no further explanation. Not because he was hiding anything, but because he wasn't the kind of man to talk about his own ideas. He just looked at the road. at the deep ruts, the mud patch, the blind curve, and knew anyone who tried the same trick here would have done it. But the truth was that no one else did. German command gathered eyewitness reports from infantry, drivers, even captured Soviets who survived the rout. All described the same thing: explosions hitting at impossible moments, vehicles destroyed the instant they moved, and a single firing point that appeared to command the entire column. Captured Soviet soldiers told a different version of the story. They believed the Germans had hidden multiple guns. Some said 3. Others swore there were 6. One insisted they faced a full anti-tank company. None could accept that it had been one gun, one crew, one angle. A staff officer walked the entire length of the destroyed column with a small team, marking each wreck on a map. When he reached the bend, he studied the ground carefully. He tested the mud with his boot. He observed the slope. He rolled his weight gently forward, mimicking the motion of a tank approaching the curve. Only then did he see it, the way the hull would momentarily level when the track slipped into the softer patch. He placed a stick upright in the mud to mark the exact position, turned to face the German gun, and realized the alignment was perfect down to the centimeter. "It shouldn't be possible," he said, "but it is." Word of the gunner's tactic spread through the unit over the next hour. Soldiers gathered around the AT gun, not cheering, not celebrating, but just trying to understand how they had survived a Soviet armored column with so little firepower. One infantry sergeant summed it up quietly: "He didn't stop the tanks, he stopped the road." By the afternoon, higher command radioed the frontline unit, demanding a full explanation of the destruction on the forest road. They wanted diagrams, measurements, an account of every shot fired. The gunner didn't give them diagrams. He didn't draft a formal report. He simply walked to the bend, pointed at the mud patch, and said, "That was the weak point. Everything else followed." But command wasn't satisfied. They wanted more. They wanted to know what kind of man could calculate a battlefield like this, in seconds, under pressure, with no time to think, and they wanted to know whether this tactic could be used again. By evening, the forest road was secured. Fires still burned inside the Soviet wrecks, crackling quietly beneath drifting smoke. German troops searched the area for maps, radios, documents, anything useful. But the officers were interested in only one thing: the gunner's method. They gathered around him as he cleaned the barrel, each officer holding a notepad. The questions came quickly. "How did you pick that firing angle? What calculations did you use? Could other crews repeat this? Was this a practiced tactic?" The gunner didn't have complex answers. He simply said, "The road forced them to move the same way every time." Command pressed harder. They believed he was hiding some formula or special training. But he hadn't learned this in a classroom. He had learned it through years of watching vehicles move. Not in battle, but during marches, repairs, field drills. He understood how weight shifted, how suspensions behaved, how drivers reacted when roads tightened or terrain changed. He had seen countless vehicles tilt, slide, correct themselves, and he had always remembered those movements. To him, the mud patch wasn't just mud. It was a mechanical pivot, a predictable moment in a machine's motion. When the Soviets entered that patch, each vehicle flattened for only a heartbeat. But the heartbeat was consistent. All he did was fire. During that heartbeat, German officers returned to the wrecked road with tape measures and markers, trying to break down the tactic into steps. They mapped out where each shell had hit, charted the angles, and measured distances. They tried to reduce the event to numbers that could be passed on to other crews. But the more they measured, the more they realized the truth. The tactic wasn't reproducible, not reliably, not without someone who understood machines as intimately as the gunner did. One officer finally admitted, "You didn't use the terrain, you read it." The gunner didn't respond. He wasn't interested in analysis or recognition. He simply loaded the gun back onto its carriage and prepared to move out with the crew. As the sun dropped, the reinforcements gathered the final Soviet prisoners, exhausted, soot-covered, and stunned. They couldn't understand how their powerful column had been dismantled before they could even form a proper line of battle. German interrogators confirmed their confusion. Most had never even seen the AT gun during the entire ambush. To them, it remained an invisible executioner somewhere in the forest. The German commander stood beside a burned T-34, and surveyed the road one last time. The blocking wrecks formed a perfect sequence. Tank at the front, truck in the center, tractor at the rear, all shots fired from a single point, all destroyed through timing alone. "It looks like a planned demolition," one officer remarked. "No," the commander said. "It looks like instinct." The gun crew finally began rolling their weapon back along a narrow forest trail. The gunner walked behind it, hands in his pockets, his expression unchanged. He had no idea that his actions would be discussed by officers for days, nor that they would attempt to codify his instinct into doctrine. But doctrine could not replicate what happened. The road, the mud patch, the blind bend, the spacing of the Soviet vehicles, the fear, the hesitation. Everything had aligned perfectly in those 2 minutes. It would never happen exactly the same way again. Yet the impact was undeniable. An entire Soviet column had been neutralized. Reinforcements had arrived safely because of the delay. A critical section of the forest road remained under German control. And no German soldier in that sector forgot the sight of burning armor sealing the road like a wall. Before leaving the area, the commander approached the gunner. "You saved the line today." The gunner shrugged, unwilling to accept praise. "I just fired when the target was weakest." The commander nodded slowly. "That's what everyone tries to do. But you saw weakness in a place no one else even looked." They walked in silence for a few steps. Then the commander added, "This wasn't luck. It was a moment only you could see." The gunner didn't answer. He didn't need to. Behind him, the road smoldered with wreckage, evidence of a tactic that could never be fully explained, never reliably taught, and never repeated with the same devastating effect. Because sometimes a battlefield isn't won by firepower or numbers. Sometimes it is won by someone who sees the one detail that everyone else overlooks. And on the 30th of July, 1943, that detail was a single patch of mud and a gunner who understood exactly what it meant. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more World War II stories.